Hey, Lance here, the Vintage Speaker Audiophile. I've had some requests to do a piece on cables, so I thought I'd do one here. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm not a cable guy. I'm not into, $10,000 cables and things like that. I'm a little more practical, but we'll talk about where that actually may be applicable too. But this is the standard cable that I use when I'm able to. This is some 12 gauge cable I got off of Amazon. Pretty good price. I've got some banana plugs on the ends. Most modern speakers will take banana plugs, so that helps. But now is 12 gauge enough, or is 12 gauge too much? That's a good question. Before we go too much further, let's just take a look on the web and see what the web recommends. So I just did a simple Google search on recommended gauge wire for stereos, and up pops something from Yamaha, which is quite interesting. Here it says 22 gauge is good at 8 ohms up to 12 feet, 20 gauge up to 20 feet, and 18 gauge 32 feet, 16 gauge 48 feet. So definitely it seems to have, length of wire is important here. But wait a minute, 22 gauge, 20 gauge? What happened to 12 gauge and 14 gauge and all those? Is this recommendation bad, or are we under the impression that we need more wire than we do? Well, this set of recommendations is consistent with something that I've always seen, and if you go back through history and you look at stereo cable guidelines, you'll see that 18 gauge wire is what was recommended for up to many feet, and if you went too much past that, then they recommended 16 gauge wire. Well, where did this 12 gauge wire and 14 gauge wire requirement come in? Let's take a look at one of my speakers first to see what it can support. So any pair of speakers that supports banana connectors for their terminal posts, you can put just about any wire into a banana connector, and that's a good thing. But look at these old JBL L88s from the 70s. These terminal posts, I had a hard time getting 16 gauge wire into these. You can see just how small the connection is. I think they were designed for 18 gauge. Now this is JBL back in, arguably their heyday. They weren't too concerned with 12 gauge cables back then. Otherwise they would have, changed out their terminal posts. So the question becomes is, this modern phenomena or modern demand for large cable sizes, is that, a marketing gimmick, or is it something that actually improves the sound? So whenever I think about this issue, the first thing I think about is power requirements. How much power can these cables support? And this is where, this is one of the things where I'm not so much of a cable guy, is because most listening is done at 1 watt or less. But let's say you're pushing 100 watts through the wires. That's still it's a trivial amount of power for an 18 gauge or a 16 gauge wire to handle. Think of think of a space heater in the house that draws 1800 watts, and that just has normal lamp cord tied to it. So if I can push 1800 watts to a heater, I should be able to push 100 watts through the same cable, and for sure only 1 watt. Now remember, 1 watt is a lot of power. Most speaker sensitivity is above 90 decibels at 1 watt. So you're talking about 90 decibels is quite loud. If you want to know how loud 90 decibels is, get yourself a cheap decibel meter and measure your own system. I think you're going to be quite surprised at how little power you're pushing through your system, because most listening is done at under 90 decibels, at 80, 85, sometimes 75. So power certainly is not an issue. We don't need 12 gauge cables to deal with the power from even a 1,000 watt amp. I'm sorry, we don't. 16 gauge works just fine. Even 18 gauge will work with most amplifiers. Now, another factor to consider is, what about the speaker wire inside the speakers? I refurbish speakers as a hobby, and while I may use 12 gauge occasionally to bring power to the speakers, when you open them up, you find smaller wires inside, quite a bit smaller wires. So the speaker manufacturers don't seem to care, so much about 12 gauge cables, because otherwise they would use, bigger wire inside the speakers. Instead, you've got 18 gauge and 16 gauge inside. And not to mention, the circuit boards, how much power are they able to take? They don't need to take that much power. They just don't need to take that much power. 100 amps, 200 amps, 300 watts, I mean. Now, there's going to be exception with professional audio. I mean, if you're pushing 5,000 watts through a speaker, then these considerations are, you got to look at things a little differently. But for home audio, from a power perspective, I don't see why you need anything more than 18 gauge wire. Now, like I said earlier, I'm not much of a cable guy, but I do appreciate that there are, people that appreciate high quality cables, and there are systems capable of showcasing their differences. One of the things that we haven't talked about here is the quality of signal over the wire, and that is something that certainly can be a factor. Now, I'm not intimate with all of that. But here's my comment on that. I think when you develop a system that is so sophisticated in sound that the difference in cable quality actually is audible, then it's your time to move to different cables, whether it's wider gauge or, better copper or better shielding or whatever it is. But for the layman stereo, I just don't see that to be an issue. Some audiophiles take this to the extreme and claim that just leaving your cables on the floor can introduce sonic qualities because of the vibration. So they recommend that you use cable risers. So as your cable runs across the floor, you have them up off the floor. My stereo system is not that sophisticated. I'm sorry, it's just not. I think I have a great sounding stereo, but I don't think I'm going to tell the difference between if I can get the cables up off the floor or not. Just like I've been unable to tell the difference between using, let's say, a 12 gauge copper wire or a 16 or 18 gauge copper wire. I just don't see the difference, or I don't hear the difference, obviously. So I realize this is a controversial topic, so I would appreciate comments on this. If there's aspects of this that I'm missing, let me know, because I want to educate myself. I'm very open to, if there's something I'm missing, I want to know about it. But my focus really has been on power and power transfer, and you don't need 12 gauge cables to transfer power from your 100 watt or 200 watt amplifier. Anyway, Lance here, the Vintage Speaker Audiophile. Thanks for watching. You've gotten this far. Hey, hit subscribe and like if you find value in this. It really helps the channel. And I want to thank everybody that have done that before, because we're really getting some traction with the channel now. We're up many hundreds of subscribers now, and we just started out about 9 months ago. So thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you again.